High in the mist-draped hills of eastern Tennessee, where the mountains brood like ancient sentinels and the valleys lie cloaked in secrets, there stood a house that felt less built than born. The Grimshore estate, with its weather-beaten clapboard walls and creaking wraparound porch, seemed to rise from the very soil, as if the land itself had conjured it into existence. For 3 generations, it stood silent watch over the family whose name it carried, a name whispered with both reverence and dread. But in the bitter winter of 1863, as the nation was torn apart by civil war, Grimshore became something far darker than a family home. What happened within those walls was so unspeakable that the truth was buried beneath layers of fear and silence. The story I'm about to tell comes from scraps of journals, letters that were never sent, and tales passed down in trembling voices. It reaches back to a time when superstition and science collided, and when the veil between our world and the next was no thicker than the morning mist drifting across the Cumberland River. This is not just a story of war or loss. It is a haunting reminder of what happens when the dead refuse to stay buried. The Grimshore family had been respected landowners since before Tennessee claimed its statehood. Their patriarch, Augustus Grimshore, a stern-faced man of 63 with a silver beard and eyes the color of storm clouds, had built a modest fortune in timber and tobacco. While not among the wealthiest plantation owners, the Grimshores commanded respect throughout Sullivan County. Augustus had married twice in his life. His first wife, Eleanor, bore him 2 sons, Thaddeus and Jeremiah, before succumbing to consumption in 1837. His second wife, Victoria, nearly 20 years his junior, had given him a daughter, Cordelia, now a young woman of 22, with her father's penetrating gaze and her mother's delicate features. As the war tore the nation asunder, it similarly divided the Grimshore family. Thaddeus, the eldest at 34, had joined the Confederate cause early, rising to the rank of major in the Tennessee Volunteer Infantry. Jeremiah, younger by 3 years, had shocked the county by declaring for the Union, moving north to Kentucky, where he served as a captain. This division had nearly destroyed Augustus, who had forbidden his younger son's name to be spoken within the walls of Grimshore. Victoria had withdrawn into herself, spending days at her embroidery or reading passages from her Bible, speaking little except to her daughter or the household staff. Cordelia, meanwhile, had become the practical force that kept the estate functioning amid the chaos of war, overseeing the diminished crops and managing the few servants who remained loyal to the family. On the 15th of January, 1863, as a bitter cold front swept down from the mountains, a letter arrived at Grimshore bearing the news that Thaddeus had been grievously wounded at the Battle of Stones River. Augustus immediately prepared to journey to the Confederate Field Hospital near Murfreesboro, where his son was fighting for his life. "I shall return with Thaddeus or not at all," he told Victoria and Cordelia on the morning of his departure, his breath visible in the frigid air of the drawing room. "Should God take him from us, I would not leave him to be buried in foreign soil." Victoria merely nodded, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles whitened. Cordelia, ever practical, ensured her father had sufficient provisions and his warmest coat for the journey. "The farm hands report Union patrols along the western ridge," she warned. "Take care not to encounter them, father." Augustus scoffed. "I've traveled these hills for 60 years, child. No blue-bellied stranger will find me if I don't wish to be found." Before dawn the following day, Augustus departed on horseback, leaving the women with their longtime housemaid, Bessie, the stable master, Elijah, and his son Samuel, a boy of 14 who helped with the horses and minor chores. What transpired over the next 27 days would forever alter the fabric of reality at Grimshore Estate, leaving scars that transcended the physical world. 3 days after Augustus's departure, winter descended upon eastern Tennessee like a vengeful spirit, bringing with it a storm of startling ferocity. Snow fell in relentless sheets, swallowing the hills and valleys until the countryside lay buried beneath a cold, white silence. It drifted high against the sides of the Grimshore house, wrapping the old estate in a frozen shroud, isolating it like a lonely ship marooned at sea. All through the night, the wind screamed and clawed at the walls, rattling window panes and coaxing mournful creaks from the timber frame, as though the house itself were groaning in pain. Victoria, ever delicate and fretful, retreated to her bed, complaining that the chill aggravated her rheumatism. The care of the household fell squarely upon Cordelia's shoulders, who worked tirelessly to keep the hearths blazing and carefully ration the dwindling supplies of food as the storm tightened its grip. On the evening of January 23rd, as the blizzard dulled to a heavy, oppressive quiet, Cordelia sat by the drawing room fire, mending one of her father's worn shirts. Suddenly, the door burst open with a slam of urgency, and Bessie stumbled in, her dark face drained of color and her hands trembling. "Miss Cordelia," she gasped, breathless with terror. There's someone out by the edge of the orchard." Samuel came running from the stables. He swears he saw a figure standing there, just watching the house. Cordelia stiffened, setting aside her needle and thread. "It's likely just a lost traveler seeking shelter from this cursed storm," she said firmly, though a ripple of unease threaded her voice. "Tell Samuel to prepare the spare room in the servants' quarters. We will not turn away anyone in need, not in weather like this." But Bessie only shook her head, eyes wide with fear. "No, miss," she whispered. "Samuel says it ain't natural. Says it's just standing there, in the snow and not moving, not breathing." Her voice quavered as she leaned closer, barely daring to speak the final words. "And he swears, miss, its shadow falls the wrong way against the setting sun." A chill that had nothing to do with the January air crept up Cordelia's spine, but she maintained her composure. "Nonsense, Bessie." The boy's eyes were playing tricks on him in the twilight. "Tell Elijah to take the rifle and investigate. If someone needs assistance, we shall provide it." Bessie curtsied and hurried from the room, though Cordelia noted how the woman made a subtle warding gesture as she departed, a superstitious habit from her childhood in the Caribbean that typically emerged only when she was truly frightened. Cordelia moved to the window that overlooked the apple orchard, now a collection of skeletal trees half buried in snowdrifts. The sun had nearly set, casting long purple shadows across the pristine white ground. At first, she saw nothing unusual and had begun to turn away when a movement caught her eye. At the orchard's edge stood a figure, just as Samuel had described. Even from this distance, Cordelia could discern it was a man, tall and straight-backed, wearing what appeared to be a long coat. He stood perfectly still, seemingly impervious to the bitter cold, looking directly toward the house. But what caused Cordelia's breath to catch in her throat was exactly what had frightened young Samuel: the man's shadow. Though the setting sun was behind him, his shadow stretched not toward the house as it should have, but away from it, toward the forest beyond the orchard, as if cast by some impossible light source. Cordelia blinked hard, certain her eyes were deceiving her. When she looked again, the figure was gone. That night, Cordelia found sleep elusive. The wind continued its assault on the house, and somewhere in the darkness, a shutter had come loose, banging rhythmically against the siding like a metronome counting down to some dreadful event. She had instructed Elijah to search the orchard, but he had found nothing. Not even footprints in the snow where the figure had stood. Just as she was finally drifting toward unconsciousness, a soft rapping at her bedroom door snapped her back to alertness. "Yes, who is it?" she called, reaching for the oil lamp on her bedside table. The door creaked open to reveal Victoria, her gray-streaked hair hanging loose around her shoulders, her nightgown ghostly white in the darkness. "Cordelia," she whispered, her voice strangely childlike, "there's someone in the house." Cordelia lit the lamp, casting her mother's face in amber light and deep shadow. "You're having a bad dream, Mother. Come, let me take you back to your room." Victoria shook her head emphatically. "No dream. I heard footsteps in your father's study and voices. A man's voice, but not your father's. Someone is here." Sighing, Cordelia rose and donned her dressing gown. "Very well, I'll investigate, though I suspect it's nothing more than the wind playing tricks on an old house." Taking the lamp, Cordelia guided her mother back to her bedroom, tucking her beneath the quilts before promising to check the study. Victoria grabbed her wrist with surprising strength as she turned to leave. "Be careful, child. There are forces abroad tonight that mean us harm." I feel it in my bones." Cordelia gently extracted herself from her mother's grip and offered what she hoped was a reassuring smile. "Nothing can harm us here, Mother. This is our home." How wrong she was. Augustus Grimshore's study was located on the ground floor at the western end of the house. It was a masculine space dominated by a large oak desk, walls lined with bookshelves, and the mounted head of a 12-point buck Augustus had shot in his younger days. The room always smelled of pipe tobacco and leather, since Cordelia had associated with her father since childhood. As she approached the study, lamp held high, she indeed heard what might have been footsteps, a soft shuffling coming from behind the closed door. She hesitated, her earlier confidence wavering. If an intruder had somehow entered the house, she was ill-equipped to confront them. Perhaps she should wake Elijah. Before she could decide, the sound stopped. After a moment's silence, Cordelia gathered her courage and opened the door. The study was empty, yet not undisturbed. Her father's chair had been pulled away from the desk, and several books lay open on its surface. Books her methodical father would never have left in such disarray. Most disturbing of all, the air held not the familiar scent of tobacco, but something acrid and unpleasant, like wet ashes or rotting vegetation. Cordelia moved cautiously to the desk, holding her lamp above the open books. One was her father's ledger, another a family Bible, and the third a volume of Tennessee history. None seemed to be open to any significant page. As she leaned closer, the flame in her lamp flickered violently, then steadied, casting her shadow against the far wall. Cordelia froze as a horrible sensation crawled across her skin. Her shadow, which should have mimicked her posture of leaning over the desk, instead appeared to be standing upright, its arms at its sides. And then, as she watched in mute horror, her shadow raised one arm, though she herself remained perfectly still. Cordelia dropped the lamp. Darkness engulfed her as the flame extinguished, and in that perfect blackness, she heard a soft, sibilant whisper. "Grimshore blood returns to Grimshore land." Cordelia fled, not stopping until she reached her bedroom, where she barricaded the door with a chair and huddled beneath her quilts until morning light seeped through her curtains. She told no one of what she had witnessed, convincing herself it had been a product of exhaustion and worry over her father and brother. The following day brought clear skies, but no respite from the bitter cold. Cordelia went about her duties with determined normalcy, though she avoided her father's study entirely. Victoria remained in her room, claiming headaches and refusing food. Bessie reported that the chickens had stopped laying and one of the horses in the stable had kicked down its stall door in the night, injuring itself so severely that Elijah had been forced to put it down. "Bad omens, Miss Cordelia," Bessie murmured as she stoked the kitchen fire. "Something wicked has set its eye on Grimshore." "I'll not have such talk in this house," Cordelia replied sharply. "We have enough real concerns without manufacturing superstitious nonsense." But that night, as darkness once again claimed the land, Cordelia found herself lighting candles in every room she occupied, unable to bear the thought of shadows gathering in corners or stretching across floors. Just after supper, which Cordelia ate alone in the dining room, a pounding at the front door shattered the evening quiet. Cordelia jumped to her feet, her heart racing. No one in their right mind would be traveling in such weather after nightfall. Elijah appeared from the back of the house, rifle in hand. "I'll see to it, Miss Cordelia." "No," she said, surprising herself with her decisiveness. "I'll go with you." Together, they approached the front door, Elijah slightly ahead with his rifle at the ready. The pounding came again, more insistent. "Who goes there?" Elijah called, his deep voice steady despite the tension evident in his posture. "For God's sake, let me in," came a man's voice from the other side, hoarse with cold and exhaustion. "It's Jeremiah Grimshore. My brother's in dire need." Cordelia gasped. Jeremiah, the estranged son, the Union officer, the name forbidden in their household. And with Thaddeus, Elijah looked to her for instruction, his expression troubled. Cordelia nodded, and he unbolted the door. The figure that stumbled across the threshold was indeed Jeremiah Grimshore, though so changed that Cordelia might not have recognized her own half-brother had he not announced himself. Always lean, he now appeared gaunt, his cheeks hollow beneath his unkempt beard. His Union uniform was tattered and stained, and his left arm hung in a crude sling fashioned from what looked like a Confederate flag. But it was the burden he carried that drew Cordelia's attention. A man supported against Jeremiah's right side, head lolling, feet dragging. This second man wore the remnants of a Confederate officer's uniform, and even through the dirt and dried blood that caked his face, Cordelia recognized her eldest brother, Thaddeus. "Help me," Jeremiah gasped. "He's alive, but only just." Elijah immediately took Thaddeus's weight from Jeremiah, lifting the unconscious man as if he were a child. "Where shall I take him, Miss Cordelia?" "The parlor," she replied. "There's a fire there. Quickly." As Elijah carried Thaddeus away, Cordelia turned to her estranged brother. 1,000 questions battled for precedence, but Jeremiah spoke before she could. "I know I'm not welcome here. Father made that abundantly clear. But I couldn't leave Thaddeus to die in that butcher's tent they called a hospital." He swayed slightly, steadying himself against the wall. "I'll go once I know he's cared for. You have my word." Cordelia stared at the brother she hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. Despite everything, his betrayal of Southern values, his abandonment of family, his choice to fight against his own kin, in this moment, she saw only the boy who had taught her to fish in the creek and fashioned whistles from willow branches for her. "You'll do no such thing," she said finally. "You're as much a Grimshore as any of us, whatever Father might say. Come, you look half frozen yourself." Relief washed over Jeremiah's haggard face, followed quickly by concern. "Where is Father? And Mother?" "Father journeyed to find Thaddeus when we received word he was wounded. Mother is unwell. The war has taken a toll on her spirits." Jeremiah nodded grimly. "It has taken a toll on us all." In the parlor, Elijah had laid Thaddeus on the sofa nearest the fire. In the warm light, Cordelia could better assess her eldest brother's condition, and her heart sank. His skin held a grayish pallor, his breathing was shallow and irregular, and a crude bandage wrapped his torso, dark with old blood. "Bessie?" Cordelia called, and the housemaid appeared almost instantly, as if she'd been hovering nearby. "Bring hot water, clean linens, and Mother's medicine chest. Hurry." As Bessie rushed to obey, Jeremiah collapsed into a chair, exhaustion finally claiming him. "How did you find him?" Cordelia asked, kneeling beside Thaddeus and gently brushing matted hair from his forehead. His skin burned with fever. Jeremiah's eyes were half closed, but he roused himself to answer. "Pure chance or providence, if you prefer. My regiment was ordered to secure a crossroads near the field hospital where Confederate wounded were being treated. I thought perhaps I might encounter someone who knew of Thaddeus. Instead, I found him." "You risked court-martial bringing him here," Cordelia observed. A bitter smile twisted Jeremiah's lips. "I'm already absent without leave. What's one more charge? Besides, blood is thicker than causes, sister. Whatever uniform he wears, he's still my brother." Bessie returned with the requested supplies, and together they set about cleaning Thaddeus's wounds and making him as comfortable as possible. The primary injury was a bullet wound to his right side, which had become badly infected. Cordelia cleaned it as best she could with whiskey and packed it with a poultice of herbs from her mother's stores, while Jeremiah held his brother down through his moments of semi-conscious agony. When they had done all they could, Thaddeus lapsed back into a fitful sleep, his breathing slightly stronger, but still labored. "He needs a proper doctor," Cordelia said, washing blood from her hands in a basin of now pink water. "There are none to be had," Jeremiah replied wearily. "Every surgeon for 50 miles is overwhelmed with wounded from Stone's River. I've seen butchers with more medical knowledge than some of the men treating soldiers." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, head bowed. "All we can do is keep the wound clean, keep him warm, and pray." Cordelia nodded, then instructed Elijah to prepare the guest room for Jeremiah. The old stable master looked uncertain. "The master won't like it, Miss Cordelia," he ventured cautiously. "Him being Union and all." "The master isn't here," Cordelia replied firmly. "And I won't have my brother sleeping in the barn like a vagrant. Make up the room, please." After Elijah departed, an awkward silence descended between the siblings. Finally, Jeremiah spoke. "You've grown up, little sister. There was a time you wouldn't have contradicted father, even in his absence." Cordelia managed a small smile. "There was a time you wouldn't have worn Union blue. We all change." Jeremiah studied her face, his expression softening. Not all change is for the worse, it seems. Their moment of reconciliation was interrupted by Victoria's voice from the doorway, high and tremulous with shock. "Jeremiah, is it truly you?" The siblings turned to find their mother standing there in her nightgown and wrapper, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Hello, Mother," Jeremiah said gently, rising to his feet. Despite his exhaustion, Victoria took a halting step forward, one trembling hand extended as if to touch him and confirm his solidity. Then her gaze fell on Thaddeus's prone form, and she let out a small, wounded sound. "My boys," she whispered. "Both my boys returned to me." "Yes, Mother," Jeremiah said, moving toward her. "We've come home." Victoria's expression suddenly contorted from joy to terror. She backed away, shaking her head violently. "No, no. This is some devil's trick. My sons cannot both be here. One serves the righteous cause, the other betrayed his blood. The shadows look at their shadows." Bewildered, both Cordelia and Jeremiah instinctively looked down. The firelight cast their shadows across the parlor floor, elongated but otherwise unremarkable. "Mother, please," Cordelia began, but Victoria was already backing from the room, her eyes wild with fear. "The shadows walk in different directions. Don't you see? This house will devour us all." With that cryptic pronouncement, she fled upstairs, her footsteps receding down the hallway followed by the slam of her bedroom door. Jeremiah turned to Cordelia, confusion and hurt evident on his face. "Has she been this way long?" Cordelia sighed, suddenly feeling the weight of months of worry. "She's been fragile since you left. Father's bitterness poisoned her, I think. And then with Thaddeus going to war as well, she spends most days in her room with her Bible and her laudanum." "I'm sorry," Jeremiah said softly. "I never meant to cause such pain. I only followed my conscience." "I know," Cordelia replied, though in truth she had never fully understood his choice. "Come, you need rest. Tomorrow we can determine what's to be done about Thaddeus. And perhaps Mother will be more herself after sleep." But as they left the parlor, Cordelia couldn't help glancing back at the shadows cast by the fire. For just a moment, so briefly she convinced herself she'd imagined it. She thought she saw 3 shadows where only 2 people stood, the third elongated and distorted, stretching toward the ceiling rather than across the floor. That night, the storm returned with renewed fury. Wind shrieked around the eaves of Grimshore like a woman in mourning, and snow piled against the windows until they were nearly buried. In the guest room, Jeremiah fell into the sleep of the utterly exhausted, while Cordelia dozed in a chair beside Thaddeus in the parlor, waking every hour to check his fever and moisten his lips with water. Near midnight, she was startled awake by Thaddeus calling out in his delirium. "The eyes!" he moaned, his head thrashing from side to side. "The eyes in the shadows. Father, don't go with them, Father." Cordelia pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, murmuring soothing nonsense as one might to a frightened child. Eventually, he quieted, though his skin still burned beneath her touch. As she settled back in her chair, a floorboard creaked in the hallway outside the parlor. Cordelia went still, listening. The creak came again, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving toward the front of the house. "Bessie," she called softly, not wanting to disturb Thaddeus. "Is that you?" No response came, only another footstep, then silence. Steeling herself, Cordelia rose and moved to the parlor doorway. The hallway beyond was dark, save for the faint glow of embers from the kitchen hearth at its far end. She could see no one. "Elijah? Samuel?" She tried again, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence that answered seemed to have weight and presence, as if the darkness itself were listening to her. Then, from the direction of her father's study, came the unmistakable sound of his chair being pushed back from the desk. Fear closed around Cordelia's throat like a vice, but she forced herself to move forward. Someone was in the house, someone who did not belong. With Thaddeus helpless and Jeremiah exhausted, it fell to her to protect them. She moved quietly to the cabinet in the dining room where her father kept a pistol for home defense. The weapon felt cold and awkward in her hand, but she had seen her father clean and load it often enough to know it was ready to fire. Heart pounding, she made her way toward the study. The door stood ajar, a thin line of light visible along its edge. Lamplight, though she had not left any lamp burning there. Taking a deep breath, Cordelia pushed the door open with the barrel of the pistol. The sight that greeted her defied all reason. Augustus Grimshore sat at his desk, pen in hand, writing in his ledger as he had done thousands of times before. He looked up at Cordelia's entrance, his expression one of mild surprise. "Ah, Cordelia, why are you wandering the house at this hour, and with my pistol no less?" His voice was exactly as she remembered it, deep, authoritative, with the slight gravel of age. "Father," she whispered, the pistol trembling in her grasp. "How? When did you return?" Augustus frowned, setting down his pen. "Return, my dear? I never left. Now put that weapon away before you harm yourself or damage my woodwork." Cordelia's mind reeled. He never left? But she had watched him ride away nearly 2 weeks prior. Had the strain of recent events caused her to imagine his departure? No, that was impossible. Jeremiah had brought Thaddeus home because their father had gone searching for him. She had not imagined that. "Father," she said carefully, lowering the pistol but not relinquishing it. "Thaddeus is here. Jeremiah brought him home. He's badly wounded." At the mention of his second son, Augustus's face darkened. "I'll not have that traitor's name spoken in this house. As for Thaddeus, I know very well where he is. Now return to your room, daughter. The hour grows late, and there are matters I must attend to." As he spoke, Augustus returned to his writing, dismissing her presence. Cordelia stood frozen, trying to make sense of what was happening. Her father seemed solid enough, yet something about him felt wrong. His movements were slightly too precise, his voice a fraction too measured. And then she noticed his shadow on the wall behind him. While Augustus bent over his ledger, his shadow stood straight, its arms at its sides, its head turned at an impossible angle to stare directly at Cordelia. A scream built in her throat, but before it could escape, the lamp on the desk flared blindingly bright, then extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. When Cordelia's vision cleared, the study was empty. No Augustus, no lamp, no sign anyone had been there at all. Shaking uncontrollably, Cordelia backed from the room. As she turned to flee down the hallway, she collided with a solid form and let out a strangled cry. "Cordelia, what in God's name?" It was Jeremiah, awakened by her movements. He gripped her shoulders to steady her, his expression alarmed. "What's happened? I heard voices." "Father," she gasped. "Father was in his study. I saw him, Jeremiah. He was writing in his ledger as if he'd never left." Jeremiah's brow furrowed. "That's not possible. Father left to find Thaddeus before I arrived with him. You told me so yourself." "I know what I said, and I know what I saw." Hysteria edged her voice. "But when I mentioned you and Thaddeus, he changed. And his shadow." She broke off, aware of how mad she must sound. Jeremiah's grip on her shoulders gentled. "You're exhausted, sister. We all are. Stress and worry can play tricks on the mind." "I'm not imagining things," Cordelia insisted, though doubt had begun to creep in. Had she dreamed the whole encounter? Was she losing her grip on reality like her mother? "Let me see for myself," Jeremiah said, taking the pistol from her unresisting hand and moving past her toward the study. Cordelia followed, her fear now mixed with a desperate hope that her brother would find some evidence to validate what she had witnessed. But the study stood empty and dark, exactly as it should have been. Jeremiah lit a candle he had brought from his room and made a thorough inspection. "The ledger is closed and on the shelf," he reported, holding the candle high to illuminate the bookcase. "The chair is pushed in. There's no one here, Cordelia, nor any sign anyone has been." Cordelia sagged against the door frame, doubt and relief warring within her. "Perhaps you're right. Perhaps I dozed off while watching Thaddeus and dreamed the whole thing." Jeremiah nodded encouragingly. "That seems the likeliest explanation. Come, let's check on Thaddeus. Then you must get some proper rest. I'll watch over him for the remainder of the night." Grateful for her brother's steadying presence, Cordelia allowed him to guide her back to the parlor. Thaddeus remained as they had left him. His breathing labored but steady, his fever neither better nor worse. "Go to bed, sister," Jeremiah urged gently. "The storm has us all on edge, but morning will bring clarity." Cordelia nodded, suddenly too exhausted to argue. As she turned to leave, Jeremiah caught her hand. "One thing, though," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "What did you mean about Father's shadow?" Cordelia hesitated. Putting into words what she had seen sounded too fantastic to be believed. "It's nothing. A trick of the light, as you said." Jeremiah studied her face for a long moment, then nodded, releasing her hand. "Sleep well, then." But as Cordelia climbed the stairs to her bedroom, she could not shake the feeling that Jeremiah had not been entirely honest in his dismissal of her experience, that something in her description of the shadow had struck a chord with him. The following day dawned clear and cold, the storm having spent its fury overnight. Cordelia awoke feeling more rested than she had expected, the previous night's encounter with her father already taking on the hazy quality of a nightmare half-remembered. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Jeremiah dozing in the chair beside Thaddeus, who appeared to be resting more comfortably. His color had improved slightly, and when Cordelia placed a hand on his forehead, his skin felt cooler to the touch. "His fever broke around dawn," Jeremiah said, startling her. She had thought him asleep. "Thank God for small mercies," Cordelia replied. "Perhaps we will not need to risk sending for a doctor after all." Jeremiah stretched, wincing as his wounded arm protested the movement. "He's far from out of danger. But yes, it's an encouraging sign." Bessie appeared with a tray of coffee and cornbread, her usual stoic expression replaced by obvious discomfort as she set it down beside Jeremiah. Like Elijah, she had been raised in a household loyal to the Southern cause and clearly found serving a Union officer distressing, even if he was a Grimshore by blood. "Will there be anything else, Miss Cordelia?" she asked, pointedly addressing only her mistress. "Has my mother risen yet?" Cordelia inquired, pouring coffee for herself and Jeremiah. "No, miss. I took her some tea earlier, but she said she wasn't feeling well enough to come down." Bessie hesitated, glancing nervously at Jeremiah. She asked if the spirits had departed. Jeremiah raised an eyebrow. "Spirits?" Bessie fidgeted with her apron. "That's what she said, sir. Asked if the spirits had gone with the storm. I told her I didn't rightly know what spirits she meant, and she just nodded like that made perfect sense and said she'd stay in her room until the shadows straightened themselves out." The housemaid shrugged apologetically. "She ain't been right since the master left. Begging your pardon for speaking plain." "Thank you, Bessie," Cordelia said. "That will be all for now." After the housemaid departed, Jeremiah turned to Cordelia, his expression troubled. "Shadows straightening themselves out. That's remarkably similar to what she said last night about our shadows walking in different directions, and to what you mentioned about Father's shadow." Cordelia sipped her coffee to hide her discomfort. In the light of day, she had no desire to revisit the previous night's inexplicable events. Mother has always been fanciful, and as Bessie said, Father's absence has been difficult for her. Jeremiah looked unconvinced but didn't press the matter. Instead, he asked, "When exactly did Father leave to search for Thaddeus?" "January 16th, so 11 days ago now," Cordelia replied. "We received word that Thaddeus had been wounded at Stones River, and Father insisted on going to him immediately." "That's impossible," Jeremiah said flatly. Cordelia stared at him, What do you mean impossible? I watched him ride out myself. Jeremiah set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. Cordelia, I found Thaddeus in a field hospital 3 days ago. He had been there since the battle ended on January 2nd. In all that time, no one matching Father's description had come looking for him. I asked specifically. Perhaps he was delayed on the road, Cordelia suggested, though a cold knot of dread was forming in her stomach. The weather has been atrocious. Perhaps, Jeremiah conceded, but there's something else. When I was changing Thaddeus's bandages this morning, he regained consciousness briefly. He recognized me and asked where we were. When I told him we were at Grimshore, he became agitated. He grabbed my arm and said, "Father is dead." I saw him fall. The coffee cup slipped from Cordelia's fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. "No," she whispered. "No, that can't be right. Thaddeus was delirious. Father left here alive and well less than 2 weeks ago." "I believe you," Jeremiah said quickly. "I'm simply telling you what Thaddeus said." He lost consciousness again before I could question him further. Cordelia bent to gather the broken pieces of china, grateful for the momentary distraction. Her mind raced. If Thaddeus believed their father dead, and if no one at the hospital had seen Augustus, then who or what had she seen riding away from Grimshore 11 days ago? And what had she encountered in the study last night? As if reading her thoughts, Jeremiah said quietly, "I think we need to consider the possibility that something unnatural is occurring in this house." Cordelia looked up sharply. "Unnatural? What do you mean?" Jeremiah hesitated, then said, "Last night, after you went to bed, I decided to have another look around Father's study. I found something odd." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. This was inside the ledger, the same ledger you said you saw Father writing in. Cordelia took the paper with trembling fingers and unfolded it. It contained a single line of text in what was unmistakably her father's handwriting. "Grimshore blood returns to Grimshore land." The exact words she had heard whispered in the darkness the night she dropped her lamp. "Where did this come from?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "As I said, it was in Father's ledger." "But Cordelia, look at the date in the upper right corner of the paper." In the same hand was written January 15th, 1863, the very day they had received word of Thaddeus's wounding, the day before Augustus supposedly departed. "This proves nothing," Cordelia insisted, though her conviction was rapidly eroding. "Father could have written this before he left." "Perhaps," Jeremiah allowed, "but there's more. After finding this, I went to the stables and spoke with Elijah. He confirmed that Father rode out on the morning of the 16th. But he said something curious. He said Father insisted on riding the old bay gelding, even though that horse has been lame in one leg for months. When Elijah suggested the stronger black stallion instead, Father allegedly struck him and said the bay knows the way home. A chill ran through Cordelia. That doesn't sound like Father at all. He valued the horses too highly to risk injuring one needlessly. "Precisely," Jeremiah agreed. "And there's one more thing. I asked Elijah to show me which saddle Father used. He pointed it out, the old military saddle hanging in the tack room. But Cordelia, that saddle is covered in dust. It hasn't been used in weeks, possibly months." Cordelia sat back on her heels, the broken china forgotten. "What are you suggesting? That Father never left Grimshore? That we all imagined his departure?" "No," Jeremiah said gravely. "I'm suggesting something far more troubling. I believe Father may indeed have left Grimshore, but not on the morning of January 16th, and not on horseback." Before Cordelia could respond, a sudden commotion erupted from upstairs. A crash, followed by Victoria's scream, high and terrified. Both siblings leapt to their feet and raced toward the stairs. As they reached the landing, Samuel came stumbling from the direction of Victoria's room, his young face ashen. "The mistress," he gasped. "She's gone mad." She tried to jump from the window. Cordelia pushed past him to her mother's bedroom, Jeremiah close behind. They found Victoria standing on a chair before the open window, the frigid January air swirling snow into the room. Bessie had her arms around the older woman's waist, physically restraining her from climbing onto the sill. "Let me go!" Victoria was shrieking, struggling against the housemaid's grip. "He's out there. Augustus is out there calling me. Can't you hear him? Mother, stop this!" Cordelia cried, rushing to help Bessie pull Victoria down from the chair. "There's no one out there. The cold has addled your senses." "She's confused," Cordelia insisted, looking to Jeremiah for support. "Father left 11 days ago to find Thaddeus. We all saw him go." But Jeremiah's expression was grim. "Did we? Or did we see what we expected to see, what we wanted to see?" Bessie, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "The master did go hunting in December, Miss Cordelia. I remember because I packed him a lunch for the journey, cold venison and cornbread. He never ate it, though. The bundle came back untouched." "This is madness," Cordelia whispered, but even as she said it, she felt the certainty of her memories beginning to waver. Had she truly seen her father at Christmas? Or had she, as her mother suggested, simply gone through the motions, too afraid to acknowledge his absence? And if her father had disappeared in December, who or what had she been interacting with in the weeks since? The answer came from an unexpected source. Thaddeus's voice, weak but clear, called from downstairs. "Jeremiah? Cordelia? Is anyone there?" Startled, they hurried downstairs to find Thaddeus attempting to sit up on the sofa, his face gray with pain, but his eyes lucid. "Thank God," he gasped when they appeared. "I feared you'd all abandoned me." "Never," Jeremiah assured him, helping him to lie back against the pillows. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by cavalry," Thaddeus grimaced. "But that's not important now. I heard voices, Mother screaming." "Is she well?" "As well as can be expected," Cordelia said, kneeling beside him. "Thaddeus, there's something we need to ask you. Something vital. When you were delirious, you told Jeremiah that father is dead. Do you remember saying that?" Thaddeus's expression darkened. "It wasn't delirium, sister. I saw him fall at Stones River." Cordelia and Jeremiah exchanged confused glances. "Father wasn't at Stones River," Jeremiah said slowly. "He was here at Grimshore." Thaddeus shook his head weakly. "No, he found me 2 days after the battle. Said he'd had a premonition I was wounded and rode out immediately. He helped the field surgeons tend me." His voice broke. "When the Union made another push, there was artillery fire near the hospital tents. Father shielded me with his own body. Chaotic fragment struck him in the back. He died in my arms." Cordelia felt the world tilting around her. "That's not possible," she whispered. "If father died at Stones River, then who left Grimshore on January 16th? Who have we been seeing around the house?" "No one left," Victoria said from the doorway, where she stood supported by Bessie. Her voice was stronger now, her gaze clear. "And what we've seen isn't Augustus. Not truly." "Then what is it?" Jeremiah demanded, his patience clearly fraying in the face of these impossible contradictions. Victoria moved slowly into the room, lowering herself into a chair by the fire. "The Grimshore curse," she said simply. "The shadow that walks." "Mother, please," Cordelia began, but Victoria raised a hand to silence her. "You think me mad? I know, perhaps I am. But there are things about this land, this family, that Augustus never told you children. Things he swore me to secrecy about when I married him." She drew a deep breath. The Grimshore estate wasn't always called by that name. The original settlers, the ones who built this house in 1793, were named Caldwell. They disappeared, all 9 family members, during the winter of 1807. The house stood empty for years, considered haunted by locals. Your grandfather purchased it for a pittance in 1819 and renamed it. "What happened to the Caldwells?" Thaddeus asked, grimacing as he shifted position. "No one knows for certain, but local legend held that they were taken by what the Cherokee called shadow walkers, spirits that could assume human form but cast shadows that moved independently of their bodies. These spirits were said to be drawn to places where great violence had occurred. And had violence occurred here? Jeremiah prompted when Victoria fell silent. She nodded slowly. During the construction of the house, a dispute arose between Nathaniel Caldwell and the men he'd hired to clear the land. 3 workers were killed, shot in the back as they tried to flee into the forest. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves somewhere on the property. Even if that's true, Cordelia said, what does it have to do with Father? Everything, Victoria whispered. Augustus discovered the remains while digging a new well in 1835. Rather than giving them a proper burial, he simply filled in the well and dug another elsewhere. He disturbed their rest without providing peace. She looked up, her eyes haunted. 3 months later, Elainer, his first wife, your mother, she nodded to Thaddeus and Jeremiah, fell ill with consumption and died. Consumption claimed many lives in those days, Cordelia objected. It wasn't supernatural retribution. Perhaps not, Victoria conceded. But after her death, Augustus began to see things. A figure at the edge of the orchard at dusk, footsteps in empty rooms, and shadows that moved contrary to natural law. She twisted her hands in her lap. He became convinced that the Caldwells hadn't been victims of shadow walkers. They had become shadow walkers themselves, bound to this land by the injustice done to the murdered workers. This is superstitious nonsense, Cordelia declared, though her conviction was undermined by the memory of what she had seen in her father's study. Is it? Victoria challenged. Then explain how your father could die at Stones River in early January, yet be seen leaving Grimshore on the 16th. Explain the figure in the orchard whose shadow falls away from the setting sun. Explain why for weeks now I've heard Augustus moving about his study at night, though no one else acknowledges his presence. None of them had an answer. After a long silence, Jeremiah spoke. Let's say for argument's sake that these shadow walkers exist. What do they want? Why mimic Father? Why remain at Grimshore at all? The Cherokee believed they feed on grief and fear, Victoria replied. By maintaining the illusion that Augustus still lived, the entity ensured we remained in a state of anxious anticipation, waiting for news of Thaddeus, dreading what Father might do if he discovered you had returned. She nodded to Jeremiah. And now that both of you are here, now that we begin to suspect the truth, it grows desperate, appearing more frequently, becoming less cautious in its manifestations. If what you say is true, Thaddeus said, his voice strained with pain and exhaustion, then we're in grave danger. The shadow has been exposed. It has nothing left to lose. As if summoned by his words, a frigid draft swept through the parlor, causing the fire to gutter and dim. The temperature in the room plummeted, their breath suddenly visible in the air. It's here, Victoria whispered, clutching the arms of her chair. God help us. It's here now. From the hallway came the sound of heavy footsteps, the measured tread of Augustus Grimshore returning to his home after a long journey. The door to the parlor, which had stood ajar, slowly swung closed with a decisive click. Elijah, Jeremiah called, rising to his feet. Samuel, Bessie, go find them. But the housemaid stood frozen, her dark eyes wide with terror. They can't help us, sir. The shadow walks alone at midday. Nothing natural can stand against it. The footsteps stopped outside the parlor door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a shadow appeared in the gap beneath the door. A human silhouette, distorted as if viewed through rippling water. What does it want? Cordelia whispered, pressing back against the wall. Grimshore blood, Victoria replied, her voice hollow. Blood to bind it to this world. Blood to free it from this land. The door handle began to turn, metal scraping against metal with excruciating slowness. The curtains, Jeremiah suddenly barked. Close them, all of them. Now! Galvanized by the command in his voice, Cordelia rushed to the nearest window and yanked the heavy drapes closed. Bessie, shaking but obedient, did the same with the second window. Victoria remained rooted to her chair, eyes fixed on the door. As the room plunged into artificial twilight, the door handle stopped turning. The shadow beneath the door wavered, then withdrew slightly. "It needs light to cast a shadow," Jeremiah explained tersely. "Without light, it weakens. But we cannot sit in darkness forever," Thaddeus pointed out, struggling to sit up despite his wound. "And the entity knows this house as well as we do. There are dozens of rooms with windows with lamps." "Then we need to destroy it," Jeremiah said grimly. "Mother, you said these spirits are bound to the land because of an injustice. The murdered workers were never properly buried. If we were to find their remains and provide a proper Christian burial, we have no idea where they're buried," Cordelia objected. "Father filled in the old well decades ago. The location is lost." Victoria stirred in her chair. "Not lost, hidden. Augustus made a map, said if anything ever happened to him, I was to find the remains and have them blessed by a priest." She turned to Bessie. "In my jewelry box, there's a false bottom. Beneath it lies a folded piece of parchment. Bring it to me." Bessie hesitated, glancing fearfully at the door, behind which the presence still lurked. "I can't go up there alone, mistress." "I'll go with you," Jeremiah offered, but Victoria shook her head. "No, the men must stay. It will be drawn to Grimshore men most strongly." She looked to Cordelia. "You must go, daughter. You and Bessie together. Move quickly and quietly. Do not stop for anything or anyone, no matter what you see or hear." Cordelia swallowed hard but nodded. "What of the door?" "As soon as we open it, I have Father's service revolver," Jeremiah said, drawing the weapon from his belt. "I doubt bullets will harm a spirit, but they might disrupt its manifestation long enough for you to slip past." Taking a deep breath, Cordelia moved to the door, Bessie close behind her. She placed her hand on the knob, looking back at her brothers and mother. "Ready." At their nods, she wrenched the door open. The hallway beyond stood empty, though unnaturally dark for midday, as if the shadows had thickened to the consistency of ink. Without hesitation, Cordelia plunged forward, pulling Bessie along by the hand. They half ran, half stumbled toward the stairs, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet with sounds like muffled screams. Behind them, Jeremiah called out, "Augustus Grimshore, your family knows the truth now. Your deception is ended." A howl of rage erupted from somewhere within the house. Not a human sound, but the furious shriek of something ancient and malevolent. The air around Cordelia and Bessie rippled as if with intense heat, though the temperature remained glacial. They reached the stairs and began to climb, their breath-forming clouds before them. Halfway up, Cordelia glanced back and froze in horror. At the foot of the stairs stood a figure that both was and was not her father. It wore Augustus Grimshore's features like an ill-fitting mask, the flesh sagging in places to reveal glimpses of something dark and writhing beneath. Its eyes were bottomless pits of shadow, and its mouth stretched too wide, revealing teeth like jagged obsidian shards. Most terrifying of all were the shadows that surrounded it. Not one, but dozens, stretching in all directions regardless of the light sources, twisting and coiling like living things. "Daughter," it said in a voice that was an abominable parody of her father's, "where are you going in such haste? Your father has returned home at last." "You're not my father," Cordelia managed, her voice strangled with fear. "My father died at Stone's River." The thing's face contorted with rage, the borrowed features slipping further to reveal glimpses of something ancient and inhuman beneath. "Ungrateful child, I have watched over this family for generations. I have kept you safe." "Liar," Bessie suddenly cried, her terror apparently giving way to anger. "You're the shadow that walks, the devourer of souls." The creature's attention snapped to the housemaid, and in that moment of distraction, Cordelia pulled Bessie up the remaining stairs. They raced down the hallway to Victoria's bedroom, slamming the door behind them and dragging a heavy bureau across it. "Quickly," Cordelia gasped. "The jewelry box." Bessie rushed to the ornate box on Victoria's dressing table and opened it with trembling hands. She removed the velvet-lined trays of jewelry, revealing a wooden bottom that appeared seamless. "Press the right rear corner," Cordelia instructed. remembering her mother's habit of hiding small treasures. Bessie did so, and with a soft click, the false bottom popped up. Beneath it lay a yellowed piece of parchment, folded and sealed with wax bearing the Grimshore crest. "Got it," Bessie exclaimed, just as something heavy slammed against the bedroom door. The bureau shuddered but held. "We can't go back that way," Cordelia realized, looking around desperately. "The window. We'll have to climb down." Another crash against the door, louder this time. A crack appeared in one of the bureau's carved panels. Cordelia rushed to the window and threw it open, wincing as the frigid air struck her face. Victoria's room was at the back of the house, overlooking a small garden now buried in snow. The drop was significant, at least 15 feet to the ground, but a sturdy trellis, bare of its summer roses, ran up the wall to the left of the window. "Give me the map," Cordelia instructed. Bessie handed over the parchment, which Cordelia carefully tucked into her bodice. "Now follow me. Step exactly where I step." The bedroom door splintered inward, the bureau sliding several inches across the floor. Through the gap, Cordelia caught a glimpse of darkness seeping into the room like black fog. Without further hesitation, she climbed onto the windowsill and reached for the trellis. The aged wood creaked alarmingly under her weight but held. Hand over hand, testing each grip before trusting it with her full weight, Cordelia descended. Above her, Bessie followed, whimpering softly with each gust of wind that threatened to tear them from their precarious perch. They were halfway down when Cordelia heard a triumphant howl from Victoria's bedroom. The shadow had broken through. "Faster," she urged Bessie, abandoning caution in favor of speed. The last few feet, she simply let go, dropping into a snow drift that partially cushioned her fall. Bessie followed suit, crying out as she landed awkwardly, twisting her ankle. "I can't run, miss," she gasped, clutching her injured limb. "You must," Cordelia insisted, pulling the woman to her feet. "Lean on me if you must, but we cannot stay here." Together, they struggled through the knee-deep snow toward the back of the property, where the old well had once stood. Cordelia withdrew the map with numb fingers, squinting at the faded ink. "There!" She pointed to a stand of ancient oaks that marked the boundary of the cleared land. Father marked the well's location relative to those trees. They had covered perhaps half the distance when a scream echoed from the house behind them. Victoria's voice, high and terrified. Cordelia faltered, torn between her mission and the urge to return to her family. "We can't help them by going back," Bessie said, seeming to read her thoughts. "Only by finding those bones." Cordelia nodded grimly and pressed on, half carrying Bessie through the deepening snow. The temperature was dropping rapidly, an unnatural darkness gathering at the edges of the property as if night were falling hours too early. When they reached the stand of oaks, Cordelia carefully oriented the map. 20 paces north from the largest tree," she read, looking up at the towering sentinels. One oak stood clearly taller than its brethren, its massive trunk split partway up as if struck by lightning long ago. Counting steps carefully, Cordelia led them to a slight depression in the ground, now filled with snow. Nothing visibly marked it as different from the surrounding terrain. "This must be it," she said, looking around helplessly. "But how are we to dig through frozen ground without tools?" As if in answer, a shout came from the direction of the stables. Elijah and young Samuel were hurrying toward them, the older man carrying an axe and shovel. "Miss Cordelia," Samuel called, "your brother sent us to help. Said you'd be back here looking for an old well." Relief flooded through Cordelia. "Elijah, thank God. We need to dig here quickly." The stable master nodded, handing the axe to Samuel before setting to work with the shovel, breaking through the frozen topsoil with practiced efficiency. The master, the thing wearing the master's face. "It's tearing the house apart looking for you all," he said between grunts of effort. Mr. Jeremiah and Mr. Thaddeus barricaded themselves in the parlor with the mistress. "How did you escape?" Bessie asked, huddled miserably against the base of an oak. "Through the root cellar," Samuel explained, watching anxiously as his father worked. "There's a tunnel that leads to the stables, Built during the Indian Wars, Mr. Jeremiah said. Elijah's shovel suddenly struck something that wasn't earth. A hollow, resonant thud. Found something, he announced, redoubling his efforts. Within minutes, he had uncovered the remains of a wooden well cover. The planks rotted but still identifiable. Together, they pulled the decayed wood aside, revealing a dark shaft descending into the earth. The opening was roughly 3 feet in diameter, its stone walls disappearing into impenetrable blackness below. The bodies would be at the bottom, Cordelia realized, peering into the abyss. But how are we to reach them? I'll go down, Samuel volunteered, his young face pale but determined. No, Elijah said firmly. I'll not risk my boy. I'll go myself. Neither of you may need to, Bessie said suddenly, pointing toward the house. Look. They turned to see a bizarre sight. The shadows around Grimshore were behaving unnaturally, stretching and contracting independent of the objects casting them, flowing like dark water toward their position. And moving within those shadows, barely visible, were 3 distinct shapes, human-like but distorted, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and wrong. The murdered workers, Cordelia whispered. They're coming to us. As they watched in mute horror and fascination, the shadow figures drew closer, leaving trails of blackness across the pristine snow. When they reached the exposed well, they paused, hovering at its edge like hesitant swimmers preparing to dive. Then, with a sound like a collective sigh, they plunged into the darkness of the shaft. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then a soft golden light began to emanate from the well's depths, growing steadily brighter until it illuminated the entire clearing. With it came a warmth that pushed back the unnatural cold, melting the snow in a perfect circle around the well. What's happening? Samuel asked, his voice hushed with awe. Before anyone could respond, the earth beneath their feet trembled. From the direction of the house came an inhuman shriek of rage and despair, so loud and terrible that they clapped their hands over their ears in pain. The light from the well flared blindingly bright, then extinguished as suddenly as it had appeared. In its wake, 3 objects rose from the depths, hovering momentarily above the opening before gently settling on the ground beside it. 3 human skulls, their bone yellowed with age, but intact. The remains? Elijah breathed, crossing himself, coming to claim Christian burial at last. As if his words had broken a spell, Cordelia sprang into action. Quickly, Samuel, run to the tool shed and fetch the wooden box your father uses for storing tools. Elijah, we need to dig a proper grave. Hallowed ground. She thought for a moment. The small rise behind the family cemetery. There's a stone cross there already. The men hurried to obey, Samuel sprinting toward the distant tool shed, while Elijah began trudging toward the cemetery, shovel in hand. Cordelia knelt beside the skulls, hesitantly reaching out to touch one. After all these years, she murmured, may you find peace at last. A thunderous crash from the direction of the house drew her attention. One of the upstairs windows had shattered outward, glass glittering like diamonds as it fell through the strange half-light. A figure appeared in the opening, the shadow wearing her father's face, its features now so distorted as to be barely recognizable. Grimshore? It howled, the sound carrying unnaturally across the distance. You cannot banish me. I am bound to your blood. It began to climb out of the window, its movements spider-like and unnatural. As it emerged fully onto the side of the house, it defied gravity, clinging to the vertical surface as easily as if it were level ground. Then it began to skitter down the wall, heading directly toward them. It's coming, Bessie whimpered. Sweet Jesus, it's coming for us. Samuel, Cordelia called urgently. The boy was returning, struggling through the snow with a medium-sized wooden chest in his arms. Hurry! Together, they carefully placed the 3 skulls in the box. As they did so, the ground around the well began to shift and settle, dirt and snow collapsing inward as if the shaft were closing itself. The shadow creature had reached the ground and was now racing toward them, moving with impossible speed. Its borrowed form had deteriorated further, Augustus's features melting away to reveal something ancient and inhuman beneath. a face of shifting darkness with eyes like burning coals. "Run for the cemetery," Cordelia commanded, lifting one end of the box while Samuel took the other. "Bessie, help Elijah dig. We must lay these remains to rest before that thing reaches us." They fled across the snow-covered grounds, the inhuman howls of the pursuing entity driving them on despite burning lungs and exhausted limbs. Bessie limped painfully alongside them, her face contorted with effort. The Grimshore family cemetery stood on a small rise at the southern edge of the property, surrounded by a wrought iron fence and shaded by ancient willows. Beyond the neat rows of family graves stood a solitary stone cross, marking no burial but serving as a memorial to Grimshores lost in distant lands. Elijah had already begun digging when they arrived, his shovel cutting through the frozen soil with desperate speed. The ground here, exposed to the winter sun, was marginally less frozen than elsewhere on the property. "How much longer?" Cordelia gasped, setting down the box and looking back toward the house. The shadow creature was drawing closer, darkness spreading before it like spilled ink across the white landscape. "A few more minutes," Elijah grunted, sweat freezing on his brow despite the bitter cold. "The ground fights me." "We don't have minutes," Samuel said, pointing. The entity was now close enough that they could see the details of its true form beneath the last remnants of Augustus's appearance. A writhing mass of darkness shaped vaguely like a man, but wrong in every proportion. "Keep digging," Cordelia ordered, thinking frantically. "Samuel, run to the house. Tell Jeremiah and Thaddeus what's happening. Perhaps they can distract it somehow." The boy hesitated, clearly torn between obeying and staying to protect his father. "Go," Cordelia insisted. "We need help." As Samuel sprinted away, Bessie suddenly stepped forward, pulling a small cloth pouch from around her neck. "My grandmother was a conjure woman in New Orleans," she said, her voice steadier than Cordelia had expected. "She gave me this to ward off evil spirits, said it would create a circle they cannot cross." Without waiting for permission, the housemaid began walking in a wide circle around the grave site, sprinkling a fine powder from her pouch and murmuring words in a language Cordelia didn't recognize. When she completed the circle, she stood at its edge, facing the approaching entity. "You cannot pass," she called, her voice carrying clearly through the still air. "This ground is protected by powers older than you, Shadow Walker." The creature paused momentarily at her challenge, then let out a sound that might have been laughter if it hadn't contained so much malice. It continued forward, but when it reached the invisible boundary of Bessie's circle, it recoiled as if struck. Howling with rage, it began to pace along the circle's edge, searching for a weakness. Its form seemed less substantial now, the darkness that composed it thinning in places like smoke dispersed by wind. "It's weakening," Cordelia realized. "The remains are calling its power back to them." "Done," Elijah announced, straightening with a groan. The grave he had dug was shallow but sufficient, perhaps 3 feet deep and long enough to accommodate the box. Cordelia and Elijah carefully lifted the container and lowered it into the hole. As they did so, the entity outside the circle let out a shriek of desperation and hurled itself against the invisible barrier. The air where it struck rippled like the surface of a pond, and Bessie staggered back, crying out in pain. "It's breaking through," she gasped. "I can't hold it much longer." "We need to pray," Cordelia said, remembering her mother's words about a proper Christian burial. "A blessing for the dead, but I don't know the proper words." "I do," came a weak voice from behind them. They turned to find Victoria approaching slowly across the snow, supported between Jeremiah and Thaddeus. All three looked exhausted and battered. Victoria's face was deathly pale, but her eyes burned with determination. "Mother," Cordelia exclaimed, "you shouldn't be out here." "This began with Augustus's sin," Victoria replied, her breath visible in the frigid air. "It must end with his family's atonement." As they reached the gravesite, another assault from the shadow entity rocked Bessie's protective circle. The housemaid fell to her knees, blood trickling from her nose. "Hurry," she pleaded. "It's too strong." Victoria knelt at the edge of the grave, her movements pained but deliberate. She withdrew a small Bible from her pocket and opened it to a marked page. "Man that is born of a woman is of few days and full of trouble," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He cometh forth like a flower and is cut down. He fleeth also as a shadow and continueth not." The entity shrieked as if the words caused it physical pain. It threw itself against the barrier again, and this time darkness seeped through like water through cracked glass. Victoria continued, undeterred. "As the cloud is consumed and vanisheth away, so he that goeth down to the grave shall come up no more. He shall return no more to his house, neither shall his place know him any more." Jeremiah and Thaddeus joined their voices to their mothers, reciting the familiar funeral service from memory. Cordelia added her own voice, the words coming back to her from countless family burials witnessed throughout her life. As they prayed, Elijah began shoveling earth back into the grave, covering the box containing the skulls. Each spadeful seemed to diminish the shadow creature further, its form becoming increasingly transparent, its howls fading like a retreating storm. When the grave was filled, Victoria closed her Bible and nodded to Elijah. The stablemaster retrieved the stone cross that had stood nearby, replanting it firmly atop the fresh burial mound. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit," Victoria intoned, making the sign of the cross. "We commit these souls to your mercy. May they find the peace in death that was denied them in life. May their shadows walk in the light of your grace forevermore." With those words, the protective circle collapsed entirely, Bessie falling senseless to the snow. But the shadow entity did not rush forward as expected. Instead, it seemed frozen in place, its form unraveling like a tapestry pulled apart thread by thread. "Grimshore," it hissed, its voice now distant and fading. "Remember." Then, with a sound like a long exhale, the darkness dissipated, scattered by a sudden breeze that swept across the property. In its wake, the unnatural gloom that had enveloped the estate lifted, revealing the late afternoon sun breaking through the winter clouds. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, Victoria sagged against Jeremiah, her strength finally giving out. "It's done," she whispered. "The cycle is broken." In the days that followed, a semblance of normalcy gradually returned to Grimshore. Thaddeus's condition improved steadily, though it would be weeks before he regained his full strength. Victoria seemed almost reborn, her mind clear, her movements purposeful once more. Jeremiah remained at the estate despite the risk of discovery, helping to repair the considerable damage the shadow entity had inflicted on the house. Of Augustus Grimshore, no earthly remains were ever found. Whether he had indeed died at Stones River as Thaddeus believed or had met some other fate in the North Woods as Victoria suggested, his body was lost to the chaos of war and wilderness. In the family cemetery, they erected a small stone marker beside Elaner's grave, inscribed simply with his name and the dates of his birth and presumed death. On a bright, cold morning in early February, Cordelia stood at that marker, a bunch of winter holly in her hands. Behind her, the house stood quiet and peaceful, smoke rising from its chimneys in straight columns against the clear blue sky. "I don't know if you can hear me, Father," she said softly, laying the holly on the frozen ground. "I don't know if you're truly at rest, but I hope that you are." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I understand now what you tried to protect us from. The shadow that walked these lands for generations. The darkness that claimed the Caldwells and threatened to consume us as well." A twig snapped behind her, and she turned to find Jeremiah approaching across the frost-covered grass. "Saying your goodbyes?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. Cordelia nodded. "In a way, though I'm not certain who or what I'm saying goodbye to anymore. The father I thought I knew these past weeks was never real." "Perhaps not," Jeremiah agreed. "But the father who raised us was real enough. Flawed, stubborn, sometimes harsh, but real." They stood in companionable silence for several minutes, watching their breath cloud in the cold air. Finally, Jeremiah spoke again. "I'll be leaving tomorrow. Now that Thaddeus is out of danger, I can't risk bringing trouble to Grimshore. There are patrols in the area looking for deserters. Where will you go? Cordelia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Back to my regiment, if I can find them. The war isn't over, sister. Cordelia nodded, unsurprised but saddened nonetheless. Will you ever return to Grimshore? Jeremiah's gaze swept across the property. The house with its weathered clapboard siding, the dormant orchards, the distant line of mountains blue against the horizon. I don't know, he admitted, but I think the shadows here will fall as they should from now on. As they turned to walk back to the house, Cordelia glanced over her shoulder at her father's marker. For just an instant, she thought she saw a figure standing beside it, tall and straight-backed, with a silver beard and eyes the color of storm clouds. It raised a hand as if in farewell, then faded like mist in morning sunlight. Cordelia smiled faintly and continued walking, her shadow stretching before her across the snow, pointing the way home. In the generations that followed, the Grimshore family would prosper and grow, their shadows always falling as nature intended. Always, that is, except on certain winter evenings when the light struck just so, and for the briefest of moments, a careful observer might notice that the shadows of Grimshore, cast by the setting sun, all seemed to reach toward the family cemetery, as if drawn by some ancient memory that the land itself refused to forget.